Today's discussion is on Chinese workers' uprising, union workers, and resistance in China today. I'm going to turn the chairing over to Winnie Ng. Winnie is, of course, well known to everybody in the city as the longtime person with the Canadian Labour Congress in the city, and now is the Sam Gindin Social Justice Chair at Ryerson University. And Winnie, we'll turn it over.
I guess we are all here because China, as an emerging superpower, quote unquote, in the world, is now going leaps and bounds in terms of their extensions of being a state-controlled capitalist state. And part of what has been fascinating is how all workers on the ground has been organizing, and despite all the oppressions, all the suppressions, people keep pushing and keep going. And so I'm looking forward to hear from both speakers, both in terms of the impact of globalizations, capitalism, imperialism on the going on, the daily happening, daily struggles of workers in China, but more importantly, how people have been resisting. And that, to me, it offers a whole new model of the organizing for countries in the South, more so than what's happening in the North. And so we will launch on. I'm going to start off by introducing Lu. Lu Cheng is the Assistant Professor, College of Liberal Arts in Temple Universities. Her research and teaching has been concentrated in globalization, labor, and labor movement, and the political economy of the development of in China. Her first book, Inside China's Automobile Factories, The Politics of Labor and Workers' Resistance, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015, explores the current conditions, subjectivity, and the collective actions of auto workers in the world's largest and fastest growing automobile manufacturing nations. The book provides an inside look at the daily factory life of auto workers and a deep understanding of the roots of the rising labor unrest in the auto industry. So without further ado, we'll get Lu to start off, and then I'll introduce Eli. Take it from there. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm very sorry to have this great opportunity to meet with you and meet face-to-face with all this great experts and audience. I want to especially thank Greg, Wendy, Herman, and Mark for putting together this timely and exciting forum. Their long-term work and commitment to labor and social movements and social justice has been a continual inspiration to my own work. As Lenny has noted, a large and growing wave of worker strikes and protests have rocked China in recent years. How to make sense of this ongoing working class resistance, its forms, expressions, potentials, and limits in China? And what are the implications of Chinese workers' struggles for activists and socialists in China and in other countries? In my book, I try to engage with this question by exploring the current conditions, subjectivity, and collective actions of auto workers in the world's largest and fastest-growing automobile manufacturing nation. Underlying my research agenda is a deep interest in the forms, mechanisms, and subjective experience of worker agency and working class power. How ordinary working men and women assert their rights and gain some control and dignity at work. How they interact with those who hold the power, that is, the state and the capital, and attempt to improve their work and living conditions. It is important to think the debate on worker struggles in China from the bottom up, starting with the perspective of workers and their experience. To be sure, worker agency and their actions are shaped in a dialogical interaction with the evolution of global capitalism and specific structure and contextual factors. Therefore, I try to combine ethnographic studies, her activities, and consciousness with a long-time and dynamic approach, one that emphasizes the ongoing transformation of global capitalism, while also attentive to specific national and local contexts, industry characteristics, strategies of management, employer, unions, and the state. In order to provide an inside look at the daily factory life of auto workers and a deeper understanding of the roots of rising labor unrest in the Chinese auto industry, I spent 20 months in 7 large auto assembly plants, including both state-owned and joint ventures, located in 6 Chinese cities. Between 2004 and 2011, I spent at least 2 months at each facility, talking with workers on the shop floor in work group meetings, outside factories after work. I also interviewed managers, party and union cadres, government officials, labor arbitrators, scholars, and industry experts. For 2 months each, I worked at a state-owned truck factory, as well as a Sino-German joint venture, as newsletter editor run by the factory party committee. That work allowed me to observe how production was organized, what the working conditions were like, how people interacted with one another, and what kind of exchanges took place on a daily basis. Being present inside the factory every day certainly enriched my knowledge and understanding of the complexity, nuance of the factory life. It also enabled me to contextualize what people said in their interviews and to identify the hidden and open forms of resistance on the shop floor. More importantly, I was able to document stories and evidence that would not be otherwise available to an outside researcher. This in-depth fieldwork provided the basis for both narrative and analysis of the transformation of the Chinese auto industry and its labor force, the work regime and factory social care, the social composition, wages, job spirit, the nature and extent of worker grievances and power, as well as their collective action. I also devoted my attention to the status, operations, social consciousness of farm workers and various temporary workers employed in great numbers in Chinese major assembly factories. Historically, auto workers are known for their strong workplace bargaining power and militancy in translating local struggles into major victories in broad labor movement. As a sociology Beverly Saber has studied, that treats major waves of auto workers throughout the 20th century, and argue that there has been a recurrent process whereby the geographic location production has created and strengthened the new working class and labor movements in each side of rapid industry expansion. With China becoming the new epicenter of the global automobile production, we see a similar combination of workers' growing bargaining power and grievances have contributed to rising labor unrest in the Chinese auto industry. As you have been aware, the widely reported auto strike wave in 2010 is considered a turning point in Chinese workers' ongoing struggles for higher pay, better working conditions, and continued union representation. Like most strikes in China, the strike was organized and by workers themselves. The factory union branch of the official union is the ACFTU, not support or represent them in negotiations. The workers elect their own representatives to negotiate with management. The strike success in winning concessions from employers inspired a wave of strike in other auto parts plants in Guangdong, as well as in other manufacturing sectors and regions. The strike clearly shows that the workers in China are willing and able to organize collectively, stage strikes, and negotiate with management, despite their lack of independent labor unions and the right to strike, under an authoritarian and repressive regime. But we have to ask, where is this labor threat heading? How will labor relations in the auto industry and broad political economy unfold in China in the coming decade? In answer to these questions, I identified the process and work in the Chinese auto industry today that are similar to those observed elsewhere. But I also pointed to important dynamics that are specific to the Chinese case. Among the similar dynamics at work is a fundamental contradiction between legitimacy and profitability that has characterized capitalist economy. Briefly speaking, efforts to enhance profitability tend to undermine social legitimacy and vice versa. Moreover, in China as elsewhere, companies and states have tried to overcome this contradiction by joint boundaries and creating divisions within labor force. For instance, treating one better than the other in terms of job security and other conditions. As I show in the book, however, this boundary job process creates renewed grievances and work resistance, especially among the excluded group temporary workers. Among the important elements specific to the Chinese case is time competition as a late industrialization with strong revolutionary and a state social legacy. In the context of rapid capitalist development and competition of labor, this revolution and legacy gives rise to a more acute legitimacy problem with the working class. Therefore, I'm also telling the story of how this contradiction plays out at global, national, and shop floor levels within a specific industry at a time of hyper-speed growth in post-socialist China. Given I only have, I think, 25 minutes, I want to highlight 3 things that are central to understanding current and future labor relations in the Chinese auto industry specifically and in China more generally. First, my evidence shows that Chinese auto workers have gained growing bargaining power amid the continued auto industry boom, increased scale and concentration of production, demographic shifts, and changes in state labor laws and policies. Moreover, the widely adopted just-in-time production system worldwide has increased the vulnerability of production to any interruptions in the parts to assembly lines by eliminating the buffer. This tends to both the workplace bargaining power of both assembly and parts workers along the global supply chain. As such, workers have become more embodied to redress grievances and demand better pay and working conditions from their employers. Moreover, facilitated by social media and labor rights activists, workers are increasingly well informed and organized, and they are able to stay united and elect their own union representatives to engage in collective bargaining. At the same time, China enters global competition in the mass production of automobile at the later stage of the product cycle, where competition is high and profit margins become thinner. The state-led industry restructuring since the late 1990s has increased competition and driven automakers in China to prioritize profitability and move towards a leaner and meaner work regime. Working conditions are characterized by heavy workload, intense work pace, long working hours. 10 to 12 hours per shift is very common in China, and excessive overtime. All the interviewed workers report physical strains and exhaustion of different degrees. The workers also expressed major grievances in the increased intensity of work, reduced job security, the arbitrary exercise of the management authority, the lack of advancement opportunities, and the inferior status of blue-collar workers in a hierarchy factory and social order. To be sure, Chinese auto workers' wages are about 30 to 50% higher than average manufacturing workers, even though they're still very low by international standards. But wage increase fronted by workers have not kept pace with macro growth of the auto industry in the past decade. Even this moderate wage increase was achieved primarily through overtime and increased work intensity. There was strong sentiment among the workers that they did not receive fair compensation and recognition for their work. I have lot of interview quotes, but I won't read it here. But just to quick summarize, that it is clear that the Chinese auto industry has not formed a long-term normalized wage increase mechanism consistent with the rapid growth of the industry and in labor productivity, a situation faced by Chinese workers at large. On the other hand, as one of China's bigger industries of strategic importance, the auto assembly industry has been under direct state intervention. By controlling personal decisions of senior Chinese managers through country manager personal system and large SOEs and joint ventures, central government can ensure that those enterprises carry out the economic and political agenda consistent with the goal of the public state. That is, to increase profitability while maintaining peaceful and cooperative labor relations. So this contradiction pressure the country managers in those major automakers in China to adopt a policy of labor force dualism that draws boundaries between formal workers and temporary workers. By labor force dualism, I refer to a labor system that deploys formal and temporary workers side by side on production lines, having them perform similar or identical tasks, but subject them to different treatment. Formal workers have high wages, more generous benefits, and relatively secure employment as a management effort to get their cooperation. Conversely, temporary workers have more wages, fewer benefits, and little job security as a strategy to lower costs and increase profitability. It resembles the two-tier system implemented in the U.S. auto industry. Although the second-tier workers in the U.S. are not temporary workers, but they are still treated as second-class working citizens. Among the 7 automobile factories I studied, 6 of them, the large number of temporary workers, ranging between 1/3 to 2/3 of their total factory workforce. Notably, temporary workers used to be peasant workers, hired from the countryside in the close to the automobile factories. But since late 1990s, with the rise of the labor dispatching, which is known as temporary agency work, temporary workers have been increasingly supplied by labor dispatch agencies. Those workers signed contracts with those agencies but are sent to work at automobile factories. Many of them have actually worked at the auto factory for more than 5 years, but they're still considered agency workers. They're not entitled to the benefits offered by the factory, and they can be returned to the agency if they're no longer needed without any severance compensation. During my research, I found about 2/3 of temporary workers were those temporary agency workers. The remaining student and intern workers who were used by employers as full-time temporary worker. So this actually not supposed to be as full-time workers, but because the gray area about internship, so many students were used as full-time workers. In fact, labor force dualism has been emerged as a widespread practice in large capital-intensive enterprises in China since early 2000. This dualism was introduced to lower cost and increase staff flexibility, at the same time trying to gain consent and cooperation from formal workers. But it created unintended consequences. For one thing, the management construct division among workers continuously driven a new generation of temporary workers who are increasingly urban and better educated to protest against unequal treatment. To the extent that assembly plants are able to provide job security, and relative high wages to those core formal workers. They push down job insecurity and cost-cutting measures either to find suppliers or by constructing fewer labor force within the family plans. It is not a surprise coincidence that the main source militancy has so far resided among the part workers in the subcontracting system and among temporary workers in the assembly plan. But under the highly integrated just-in-time production system, the strikes by suppliers, by part workers, and by temporary workers can effectively shut down the assembly plant and the entire production chain. In the book, I document various hidden and open forms of resistance by auto workers in the form of sabotage, slowdowns, effort bargaining, filing labor dispute cases, and wildcat strikes. In particular, I witnessed rising activism among temporary workers against unequal treatment. Given the structural constraints by these workers, including the lack of independent unions and right to strike, how are workers able to gain some confidence and control and mobilize at the ground? How are workers, and what accounts for the rising worker activism, especially among temporary workers, who are often perceived as weak, vulnerable, and docile, thanks to control their job security. So there are several reasons. First, as I mentioned before, auto workers have gained growing bargaining power. Workplace bargaining power. Even temporary workers, because there are large numbers on assembly lines, they have actually bargaining power to shut down the production. So two of the strikes are can clearly show that when temporary workers organize to stop working, the full assembly line will be affected. Second, the recomposition workforce contributed to the rising activism. After the restructuring, the formal production workers mostly were semi-skilled urban young workers with a minimum of 12-year education and 1 to 3-year renewable contracts. The new temporary workers, agency and student workers, they are a mixture of local urban and rural youth with better education and the same rights. They have similar education and skill levels compared to formal production workers. This blurs the boundaries between formal and temporary workers, previously based on the rural-urban hukou system. So now, because temporary workers are increasingly urban, so they have a very similar background with formal workers. So this contributed to the rising activism among temporary workers against the unequal treatment. And third, I'm not sure the slide, but the work group centered mass assembly production and worker collaboration at work facilitated group-based solidarity. This is a kind of labor process that generates solidarity. So China is like many other auto factories that the production is organized by groups. So the group members, they work together and they socialize together. So it's easy to organize solidarity along in the production process. More importantly, fourth, this factory provided monetary residence can facilitate workers' mobilization and collective action. So we all know that the dormitory labor regime that has been extensively in the literature is often regarded as an effective means of management control over workers. But in the auto industry, in my case, I found it become a hotbed to facilitate worker mobilization and collective action. A large number of young male workers with similar background and workplace experience did together in a concentrated factory downs, allows them to build social networks, initiate collective actions, and stay connected during strikes. Lastly, the young generation of Chinese workers, they are very technological savvy, and they are adept at using internet and social media such as QQ, WeChat, microblog, online forums, and text messages to spread information, initiate collective actions, and stay connected during the strikes. So given the widespread labor positivism, which created inequality and divisions among workers, the big questions concerning the outcome of worker resistance depend on whether on temporary workers they are able to make a common cause or they end up fighting against each other. In the book, I compare two wildcat strikes by temporary workers with different outcomes. Both strikes broke out in a spontaneous manner by several hundred student workers staying at their dorms, refusing to go to work. Both strikes were fueled by the sense of injustice with direct goal of economic gains. The June strike was initiated by the delay of workers' monthly wages. It was spontaneous and defensive in nature. In the second October strike, temporary workers demanded for an equal wage increase after the factory raised formal workers' wages exclusively. Management took a tough line. Striking workers were fired, and temporary workers only got a side raise 2 months later. There were several factors accounted for the different outcomes of the two strikes, such as timing, management, perception of strikes. I found the most important factor is whether or not former workers support temporary workers' struggles. In the June strike, the shared workplace grievances motivated former workers to stand along with temp workers. In the October strike, however, the divisive wage policy that only raised former workers' wages detached former workers from supporting temporary workers. We can see that temporary workers' struggles are more likely to succeed when their grievances are shared by former workers and receive support from the former workers. In spite of divisive labor positivism, my evidence suggests that the relationship between former and temporary workers were characterized by a dynamic rather than antagonism. This was largely due to the group-based solidarity in the enabling labor process and the fact that there hadn't been open replacement of former workers with temporary workers. Therefore, little direct competition and confrontation between the two groups of workers over jobs. Also, the socially egalitarian legacies were still relevant to both the workers and the managers. These factors indicate the possibility of developing a more engaging and cooperative relationship between the two groups of workers. To be sure, my evidence suggests that auto workers' relatively high wages and perceived difficulty in finding better alternatives, combined with the lack of independent unions and collective bargaining, have inhibited many workers from openly confronting management. However, workers' localized struggles have one specific management concessions, including higher wages and benefits for both formal and temporary workers. Moreover, by seeing auto worker resistance within the broader national context of rising labor unrest with China's rapid capital development, I show how Beijing's concern with maintaining social stability and political legitimacy have led to the passage of new labor laws to stabilize labor relations and pacify aggrieved workers. The labor contract law, for example, devoted one section and 11 articles to regulating labor dispatch and provide some legal protections for temporary agency workers. Although compromise in the lawmaking process has led to entrenched dualism and inequality between formal and temporary workers, the ongoing battle over adherence to the labor contract law suggests that Chinese labor policy is not a settled fact. Rather, it is a dynamic process as the party state fights the balance between promoting labor flexibility and profitability and maintaining stability and legitimacy with an increasingly vested working class. In conclusion, I want to highlight a few theoretical implications. First, my study showed that even labor unrest in China has not led to a formation of independent unions or competitive political parties that challenge the authoritarian party state at the national level. Widespread grassroots resistance has succeeded in winning substantial wage increases and improved working conditions for workers on the shop floor. Moreover, rising labor unrest has induced the party state to introduce new labor laws and policy changes that extend new rights for workers as part of its effort to stabilize labor relations and maintain social stability. A direct related question is where Chinese workers' localized labor unrest will lead, and whether it can push for the establishment of independent union and collective bargaining. My research has led me to a dynamic view that workers' grassroots protests will continue to push for higher wages, better working conditions, and more union organizing and labor reform from the central government and official unions. But the Communist Party is unlikely to allow any independent union to exist out of its control. The ACFTU, especially at the grassroots level, is likely to become more active in responding to workers' grievances and demands, and the threat that it would become totally irrelevant to workers and the state if it cannot deliver any meaningful gains for workers and thereby mitigating labor capital conflicts and preempt strikes. We should also recognize there are a wide range of organizations, such as labor centers, activist groups, labor NGOs, that have played an important role in supporting workers in their struggles, providing legal and practical advice, and helping them to conduct collective bargaining and maintain unity and solidarity during strikes and protests. On the other hand, the Chinese government remains firmly in charge, and it has taken an increasingly more repressive approach to worker activists and labor NGOs and rights groups in the face of the economic downturn. We can discuss more about the recent development during the Q&A section, what's the implication for labor activism in China today. So all this reminds us that the national context and historical legacies matter. We should not assume that organizing strategies, pattern, rhetoric, and direct work for the labor movement and the general improvement of worker welfare in China are the same as wisdom generated from the experience of the core countries. For one thing, the revolutionary and social legacies of the Communist Party and continued official adherence to such legacies have played and will continue to play an important role in shaping the mobilizing strategies, patterns, languages, and outcome of labor protest in today's China. It is true, as Herman has rightly pointed out in his review on my book, that we need a larger oppositional framework that poses an alternative vision of the social transformation based on class perspective with forms of conscious class organization in order to achieve more. This is not an easy task, particularly in China's current situation. But for activists and socialist scholars, the first step in that direction, I think, is understand labor struggles in China from the bottom up, starting with prospective workers and their experience. We should also need close monitor the state actors and their logic and strategies, and then try to develop a set of analytical tools that are historically and geographically grounded that help us identify the potential for transformation from below. We also need to pay close attention to the intensified boundary job dynamic in an age of labor precarity. Today, workers everywhere have been confronted with growing job insecurity and inequality between a shrinking segment of poor workers and an ever-expanding population of non-regular workers. A plain example is a widespread two-tier system in almost every sector, including higher education, where faculty members are divided between tenure-track professors and non-tenure-track adjuncts and part-time lecturers. A central and persistent question for labor movement everywhere is to find a common ground and to build solidarity across different boundaries to struggle for a more just, equitable, and inclusive world both in the workplace and in our society at large. Let me end on a positive note. If China manages to make it onto a more sustainable and equitable development path, the ongoing struggles by Chinese workers for dignity and justice will no doubt have played a critical role in taking us there. Thank you.